Professor Dr. Marvin Dunn, naval officer, psychologist, author, school founder, South Florida civil rights crusader, and that's just not for blacks.
I've been told that this question of homosexuality is a moral question. But I ask you, what is more amoral than hatred? What is more amoral than the denial of human rights?
And distinguished historian.
You could not be a chauffeur in Miami because white chauffeurs simply would not allow it.
This is our culture, growing food.
These days, he spends some of his time tilling his truth garden, where he feeds the poor freshly grown collards and hands out books banned in Florida schools.
So some of the biggest names in entertainment stayed here.
Or giving truth tours, where he teaches the history of Black Florida.
Before the railroad came in 1896, black people could swim in salt water.
All the while beating back racism and injustice wherever it surfaces.
You'll see mango trees larger here.
I met the man who's made a life pursuit of battling for the dignity of all at his childhood neighborhood in Opelika, to discover what were the roots that fed such dogged determination to defend others.
I've not really stepped foot on this property in about 50 years.
Tell me what that's like.
And what is it like? I shot marbles right there. This was the first house that I got to get in a bathtub. Before we moved here, we didn't have electricity.
The former Florida International University professor's mom and dad moved he and his 4 brothers to what remains the Bunch Park community today. He was in the 5th grade. By then, his dad a longshoreman, his mom a maid, who sacrificed much to eke out a stable life for their children.
This was paradise. This was paradise. There was nothing about this home that was not absolutely wonderful.
Back then, Bunch Park was one of the last communities in the area the federal government built homes for Black war veterans to own.
So when we moved in here, my dad and other men called the police chief in and told him, don't have the police come into Bunch Park. We don't want our children seeing the police cars going up and down on the street. If we need you, we'll call you. Drugs, never heard of. Family abandonment, never heard of. Never heard a shot fired in this neighborhood. It was wonderful. Segregated, but wonderful.
But that's not where Marvin Dunn's story starts. It begins in DeLand, Florida. As a tiny child, like so many poor blacks, he and his entire family harvested crops.
In order to stop having to pick fruit to make a living, he decided to go up on the migrant trail, go up to New York from Florida during the summertime to pick vegetables, primarily potatoes. So down on the ground picking potatoes, we look up, here comes Mom in the car with grits and sausage and eggs and all of that. And then she would get down on the ground and pick potatoes with the rest of us. She was incredible.
And she inspired his activism.
Northwest 151st Street is named after my mother, Marvin Dunn Way, because she came in here as a fighter for education, for social justice, and that's where I think I got the bug, to fight for justice, for fairness.
Fairness, something a young Dunn and others with black and brown skin weren't afforded in the old Dade County school system.
But we were bused for at least 2 years from up here all the way to Liberty City, past white schools, past white kids on the streets throwing things at the bus and calling us names, to Liberty City and back. Miami-Dade schools did not go, they were called Dade County schools then, did not go peaceably along the integration path. They resisted. And we were victims of that resistance because we were lacking the resources that were available to students who were in white schools.
Back to Dr. Dunn's path to greatness. As a young 11th grader, he was accepted to the prestigious all-black men's school, Morehouse College.
So they put me on that back seat and said, we're going to pray for you, because my mom and grandmother went to church a lot. And they got off the bus, and then my dad got on the bus. And my dad did not go to church. He was a longshoreman. And my dad was inclined to use the N-word occasionally. He told me, little N-word, stay on this seat until this bus gets to Atlanta tomorrow. You hear me? Okay, Pop. You hear me? Yes, Pop.
But Dunn disobeyed, moving to the middle of the bus where a little white girl sat down next to him.
Some white person sitting behind me said, nigger, get up. You know you don't belong up there. Others chimed in. Get back there where you belong, boy.
Dunn was kicked off that Greyhound bus in Waycross, Georgia, and told to catch the next bus to Atlanta.
That scared me. It truly scared me. And I think of it now and it brings chills to me.
Brings chills to me, and I wasn't even there.
Once at Morehouse, he thrived.
They taught us how to treat each other, how to treat other people, how to treat women. And they taught us how to fight with our brains, with our mouths. And to me, that was the rebirth for me.
And he was surrounded by college mates who would become famous, like Julian Bond, who would become a congressman and lead the national NAACP, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s brother, A.D. King. At Morehouse is where he also landed right smack in the middle of the civil disobedience movement in the Black fight for rights, with these words from his grandmother still ringing in his ears.
If somebody spits on you, you hit back, you fight back. Don't let anybody ever spit on you. So I couldn't promise Julian Bond and the others that I would be nonviolent.
After Morehouse, Dunn was ready to live his dream.
I was going to be the first black admiral in the Navy. That was my goal. My dad was in the Navy. My dad was a cook. That's the only thing black men could be in the 1940s when my dad was in the Navy.
But he says that dream was nearly deferred and derailed by bigotry upon arriving in Jacksonville, Florida.
Since I was the only college graduate, they put me in charge of the group, gave me everybody's papers. The petty officer who was in charge of the induction at that point called the 12 white guys up, gave them some tickets to go across the street to the Roosevelt Hotel, where they would sleep, take their meals, and come back the next day to be inducted. After they were gone, he called me up. I had no choice but to go across the railroad track to this house, which was really a house of prostitution, to tell you the truth. That's what it was. People sitting on the porch, drunk. When I got there, I went into the kitchen to eat. There were roaches in the kitchen. So I sat up all night, and I didn't eat dinner. The next morning, the kitchen was still repulsive. I didn't eat breakfast. And I walked back across the railroad track and took the exam for officer candidate school, and I failed. I failed it miserably.
Dunn complained about the conditions he endured.
He said, "You want to put it in writing? I'll have an officer come out and you can put it in writing."
So Dunn was relegated to the Navy's recruit program, not officers candidate school, until
this limousine drives up, big black limousine with the admiral's flags on it. "Who's Dunn?" And he pointed me out. "Get in the car." And they took me to the base commander's office. And he had that letter that I'd written in Jacksonville in his hand.
he took the exam again and passed.
And that's how I got to be an officer in the Navy. I was one of 4 officers qualified to run the ship. It was just glorious.
Officer Dunn had no regrets until a young President John F. Kennedy showed up on the bridge of Dunn's naval aircraft carrier, the Kitty Hawk. Kennedy already upset and outspoken over the Navy's lack of black officers.
That ship had 1,400 officers and 1 black officer, just 1. That's why they wanted me on that bridge.
Kennedy arrived super late, and Dunn was the only officer forced to stand waiting on the bridge for over 4 hours until the commander-in-chief landed.
Can I tell you, that man looked miserable. For about 3 or 4 seconds, our eyes met. I had never seen more pained, deeper blue eyes than I saw in that man. So I thought, he and I are the only ones who don't want to be on this bridge right now. So when that happened, that night, I decided that I was going to get out of the Navy. I didn't want to be a token paraded out to impress people.
By now, it's 1965, and Dunn is on board the USS Saratoga in the Mediterranean. He applies to pursue a doctorate at the University of Florida, but they didn't want him.
Got a letter from the University of Florida, still have it. "Dear Lieutenant Dunn, the University of Florida does not admit Negroes to its graduate programs."
The letter goes on to say UF would pay for Dunn to study in any other state.
That hurt. I think I cried that night, to tell you the truth. That I was on a ship, on a warship, defending my country, and I could not get into my own home state university because I'm a black person.
He ultimately got his PhD in psychology from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville.
So psychology appealed to me, particularly the psychology of race and the impact of race in our society.
Death toll now stands at 11, with more than 120 persons injured in the riots.
He'd put what he'd learned to work during the 1980 riots. McDuffie, meaning Arthur McDuffie, an unarmed black insurance professional and former Marine brutally murdered by 4 Dade County cops. Those officers all acquitted by an all-white jury, which sparked a bloody rampage.
There was a riot in Miami in 1980. I was very much involved as an observer of it. I went out during the riot. I saw things happening. I saw black boys, 16, 17 years old, killing a white boy who had been trapped in that riot.
But based on the evidence, the charges that were filed were appropriate.
Dunn took on then Dade County State Attorney Janet Reno over what he saw as her mishandling of the case.
I think it's her damn job to get the evidence. Have her go to the cemetery. The man is buried. That's the evidence. He's dead. What more does she want?
I wrote a book about the riot, and as I was preparing that book, I noticed that there was almost nothing written about black Miami history. I wanted there to be a story of black people in Miami-Dade County that went all the way back to the black pirates who came in the 1640s. It was unprecedented. Before that book was written, it was difficult to tell what happened to black people, when we came, and where we are. So that was written for future generations. That's the most important thing I've ever done, other than having my babies. A History of Florida Through Black Eyes is really a book about lynching in Florida. Florida's racial violence exceeds the history of any other state, even Mississippi. And those stories needed to be saved.
Writing that lynching book took Dr. Dunn to every part of Florida where white brutality against blacks raged, including Rosewood, the black prosperous town burned to the ground by a white mob who slaughtered dozens of blacks in 1923. Dunn, the filmmaker, actually talked to survivor Robbie Morton on the solemn ground of the Rosewood Cemetery.
They did lynch babies. They did, because I seen babies hanging. I sure did. Me.
Dr. Dunn bought 5 acres to preserve the history, but faced violence on his own land last year as he prepared to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Rosewood Massacre.
As I was leaving my property last September, my neighbor, whom I'd never spoken to, knew him to me since 2008, rose up in his big F-150 truck with a Confederate sign on the tag on the front. He lets the window down and he yells at me, "What's going on out here?" I said, "This is a county road, sir. We'll park wherever we want to." Set him into a rage, stepped on the gas, spins around, almost kills us, almost hits my son in particular, and he's screaming the N-word over and over again. They arrested him and charged him with using his vehicle as a weapon. But when I got back to Miami, I called the FBI and reported this as a hate crime.
The U.S. Justice Department investigated, tried, and found David Allen Emanuel guilty a few months ago on 6 counts of federal hate crimes. He faced 6 years on each count. In an act of compassion and mercy, Dr. Dunn pleaded to the court in writing and in person for leniency. Is he angry about his recent brush with death or any other atrocities committed against blacks years ago that he documents in his history books and he collects what he calls blood soil from every known location where the horror of black lynchings occurred in Florida?
Even when I go to a place where black people were murdered, were killed, were lynched, anger is not the first thing that comes to me. It's pity, it's sorrow, it's connecting emotionally with the victims. Connect to the emotion of the people who suffered these things. And if you do that, you'll have understanding about a lot of things.